I have been really looking forward to this, and it's my pleasure to introduce our poet tonight, Judith Barrington. I'm excited about that, and she is the third reader in our poetry series. She is the author of 3 books on poetry: Horses and the Human Soul, History and Geography, and Trying to be an Honest Woman. She has recorded a CD of selected poems entitled Harvest. Her prose books are Life-Saving, a memoir, which was the winner of the Lambda Book Award, and Writing the Memoir, From Truth to Art, which is used in numerous writing programs. She is extensively published. She is widely sought after as a teacher. Her work has appeared in numerous anthologies. I think you kind of get the point that I could go on and on as far as listing her publications and accomplishments. Would you join me in welcoming our poet for the evening, Judith Barrington? Judith?
Thank you, Tom. It's a delight to be here. Do those people standing around the back want to sit down? I'd be happy for you to do so if you need those chairs.
Yeah, we might later.
Okay. So many thanks to Tom and to, I'm sure, many other people who have made this series happen. It's a wonderful thing to find a whole new poetry series with all this energy for listening to poetry and producing a little chapbook. It's just a marvelous thing, and I congratulate you, and I'm honored to be part of it. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming out on this in the middle of this nasty weather. You're the brave poetry fans who have made it out. So thank you for that. Let's see. I'm going to read tonight new poems, relatively new poems, new since the last full-length poetry collection, which was Horses and the Human Soul. Some of these poems have been published in a little chapbook, and some of them have been published at this point only in journals and magazines. The chapbook is called Postcard from the Bottom of the Sea, and it's just out this month, January 2008. And as you can probably guess, it's made up almost entirely of sea poems, and quite a lot of them are in fact undersea poems. They take place in the deep oceans. This makes it logical in my mind when I was thinking about putting together a reading for you tonight, to divide the reading up into sea poems and then dry land poems. Perhaps thinking of it as the elements, the water element and then the earth element that maybe will ground us before you are sent out there into the watery earth element out there. So I'm going to read from Postcard from the Bottom of the Sea for a while. And as I say, these are pretty new. I'm going to start with the first poem in the book, which is called The Book of the Ocean. They've all written their books, the wind with its scattering of seeds, its steady erosion of terraced hills, histories carved in the gray faces of cliffs whose grief it transcribes into song. Rain with its poetry, quick rivulets or pucks that rattle on the roofs of our mind, and sunshine with its golden tales, honey in the mouths of heroes, warriors who blaze and die young. The book of the ocean is the greatest and most neglected. It floats in shadows under rock shelves. It laps at the edges of dreams, a reminder of the deep dark into which we dive nightly, a reminder of the moon that holds us and hurls us on the brink of wrinkled lands where once we staggered ashore trying to become human. It is written on wavy scrolls at the tide line. It is written as a crab on a dry desert rock. It is written in green and indigo, sometimes awash. It is written to be studied from space or through the mask on a diver's face. Its comedy splashes our feet. Its tragedy writhes in the currents of the night. Like it or not, we are turning the watermarked pages, their words hissing in our ears with blood and with salt, while the moon grows fat, then wanes to the sweetest sickle. So in that poem, I claim that the ocean, or the book of the ocean, is the most neglected area of our planet. And I say that because it's so unknown. The ocean is so relatively unknown and relatively unexplored. And also because we humans seem somewhat intent on littering it and poisoning it and destroying it before we ever get a chance to get to know it, what's down there. So anyway, this next poem, like several others in the book, does make a passing reference to trash, which is one of my obsessions about the ocean, which is full of trash. It's an image that has stayed with me, the image of the trash around the oil rigs, which is like miles deep there. And for example, in one sea area the size of Texas, it's been found that there are 6 kilos of plastic for every kilo of naturally occurring plankton. 6 kilos of plastic. And that's plastic that's swirling around like a clock going nowhere. It's been dubbed the Asian trash trail or the trash vortex. So don't be surprised that some of my poems about the sea do contain rubbish. Hopefully I'm not talking about the poetry when I say that, but you can make up your mind about that. So this is the one that got me started on this whole journey. Souls underwater. No longer tumbled by currents as when, long ago, they were lodgers in frail bodies. Now they drift free of the flesh that was sucked and nibbled from bones, and the blood that swirled away, its quick red streaking the deeps. Souls mingle in the democracy of weed, passing through great barnacled bulkheads, once passengers, transparent without furs or jewels, glide through the shiver that marks the presence of stoker or convict or the drunken oilman who one night staggered to the edge of the spider-legged rig and, dreaming of his girlfriend, unusually tender in his mind at that dizzy moment, plunged through cans and plastic trash into the arms of another. Welcome, said the souls, though his ears heard nothing. No longer sailors nor slaves, still they remember the struck bell piercing sleep, the darkness below decks where rats splashed in the bilges, the wide-eyed newborn who flew over the deck rail, saved from the plantation by her mother's arm. Oceans are thick with them, submariners floating free of their vaults, and pilots whose planes dropped from the sky like giant guillemots, but failed to surface with a catch of fish. The careless were snatched by sneaker waves, the joyful by cruising sharks, who dispatched them with a lunge and spat out their splintered surfboards. Some are surprised to find themselves here, having thought they'd ascend to the heaven of upper airs or deep star space. But these are the heavens, say the souls, the heavens below. Some of you perhaps may have read other things that I've written, either other poems or I have a memoir named Life Saving. And I mention this not to be crassly commercial, although I'm always happy when people buy books, but because you may know from having read other work that, or you may make an assumption that my almost obsession, but certainly great interest in the ocean and the deep ocean maybe stems from the fact that when I was 19 years old, my parents both drowned. And people have suggested to me that this may be a reason why I'm now continually writing about the ocean. But the fact is that I was obsessed with the ocean before that happened. I was a child who loved the sea. I loved being in the sea. I loved being on top of the sea. My father had a sailboat. We went in very rough seas on very crazy little sailboat races around the south coast of England where I grew up. So although that major and defining fact of my life obviously has something to do with the way I look at the deep oceans, it's not the only motivator. I went to school in Brighton in England, and my school was very high up on a hill, and it looked out over the ocean. It had those very thin, old paned glass windows, and sitting next to one of those, which was very cold in the winter, was an ideal spot for looking at the ocean and dreaming my way through algebra class or history class. And I think that also really was a forming factor of loving the sea, because it just took me imaginatively away from where I didn't particularly want to be. Sometimes we had our swimming class at a pool which was right down the bottom of the hill on the edge of the beach. And we went down there on the hot summer days and swam. But sometimes when the sea was very calm, we had our swimming class in the ocean. We swam right off the beach, which was always my favorite way to do it. This next poem brings back a character or a persona who has appeared in several other of my books. She's a character who allows me to write in the third person, although she is somewhat like me. Her name is the Dyke with No Name. So this one is called The Dyke with No Name Thinks About the Sea. She has never felt afraid of the sea until now, lost in fog, walking a beach, the ocean there but not there, a faint lapping to her left, the only sign that the mist no longer hides grasses hoarse with crickets, nor sand scratched with tracks, but throws its cloak over the shallow entrance where water curls and breaks and slides, apologetic on such a silent day. All her life, she thinks, she lived on the surface, slammed through heavy seas in her father's sailboat, or floated on a mattress there in the pool at Cap Sassal, or rode the rounded thighs and breasts of the bay beyond, easing her back and forth like sleeping breath. One spring, mid-Atlantic, she heard a hurricane coming and balanced on top of majestic swells to watch the hint of light through fortress clouds, the wake of the liner churning out dirty white as it sliced its steady line through ranges of water. A mile below, unseen, unthought of, land, not dry, but sandy bottom and rock, complete, she would later learn, with mountain ranges, canyons, a whole geography ignored by explorers who seemed to prefer the moon. What's underneath the painter's seascapes? Lyrical sunsets, the loudmouth purple prose of thunderclouds. What's to be found? The roots of trees, the heart of the story, the bones of the dead, dead ships, lost jewels, mountainous heaps of trash. Further down, the Lethe, the Styx, their waters seeping into the ocean's salt. And now she remembers swimming, the shock of cold sea on belly rising to shoulders, the gradual merging, the touch of the sea on her face, the lifting of hair straight up as sinking she opens her eyes and water enters her body enters water, water and body begin to lose their margins, outlines blurring until neither heavy nor light, not air, not bone, but easy water She pulls with her palms, turning her head to snatch a mouthful of air, land creature that she is, moving back towards an ancient version, scaly and finned, her feet flattening, almost remembering webs. Water defines her body as never before, her body grown sleek, her female form, her briny parts, her womanly flesh, and yes, her lesbian body, its taste a reminder of all that went before, all that a body might know. The worlds below, she thinks, are where I must go. So there are a lot of undersea creatures in these poems, and physical features of undersea landmarks or seabed marks, I guess we'd call them. And I got a lot of them just by reading, but a source of great help to me, and I feel like I want to acknowledge that, was the Mark Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport, who, when they heard I was trying to do this writing, invited me down early last year as a poet in residence to stay down there. And I spent some time at the Marine Science Center. Everyone was really friendly and incredibly patient because I have absolutely no science at all. But I loved it there, and I loved sitting in somebody's office listening to whale calls that they had recorded, playing through their computer, or browsing in the library with the librarian and learning about the octopus and all its habits. It was a wonderful time. The next poem I'm going to read actually has to do with the naming of the geographical features on the seabed, which I mentioned in that last poem, and it's the poem that has been made into a little broadside for you to take home. So you actually have it. Takes has an epigraph at the beginning, taken from a book called The Great Deeps, which is a book I love by James Hamilton Patterson, who's both a novelist and a nonfiction writer. And he writes, "It is only since the invention of a technology powerful enough to map the deep seabed that the finding of names has become a pressing issue." And the poem is called The Musician's Seamounts, which is in fact the real name of a whole range of mounts in the Pacific Ocean, not under the Pacific Ocean. The Musician's Seamounts. And I should say this has a couple of very bad puns in it, which you may pick up or may not. From Strauss in the north to Mendelssohn in the south, they compose their 200-mile chromatic scale across the fracture zone, half steps rising towards green light, then plunging 4 miles down into the abyssal plain. The climber who wants to try Mount Mozart, slightly taller than Fuji, but though nowhere near as pretty, must leave the high sea, begin her long descent past creatures that stare with bulging eyes and flick their fins as they sidle into dark. When her feet land on the summit, she wants to sing, so humming a well-loved aria from Figaro, she sets out con brio to climb to the mountain's base. Somewhere off to her left, the Bach Ridge joins in counterpoint, while elsewhere Mount Beethoven frowns. Silent now, she's listening hard for the song of the Earth's crust, that oscillation recorded by seismograms vibrating on one single note. The world itself humming cantabile through an ancient, cracked tectonic throat. That is a real thing. They've picked up these that some note that's just there and it appears. Love to think about our planet singing to itself. It's a great thought. There's quite a variety of poetic forms in this little book. I like writing in various received forms of various kinds, and I've been pushed that way because I'm in a poetry group where we set each other assignments to learn new forms. But the one that comes back a lot is the villanelle. This next poem I'm going to read is an elegy, and I tried to write it in a form which echoes the rhythm of the classical elegy. It's very difficult to do when you're not writing Greek or Latin or whatever. But that classical form has pairs of lines which have 6 and 5 accents alternately as you read the poem, which is an odd rhythm in English. But I sort of attempted to do it. I really wanted to write an elegy for this sailing ship called Mildred, which I found in a lovely book that's by John Fowles, the novelist, who probably know his work. It's a book called Shipwrecks, I think it is. And it's a book full of photographs that were taken by a family of photographers who've lived for many generations on the Isles of Scilly off the Cornish coast of Britain, and have, through all of those years, taken photographs of the ships that were wrecked around those islands because it's such a dangerous place for shipping altogether. So it's a book which compiles all these photographs of ships sideways on rocks or sinking or crashed into the cliffs, and with a marvelous text by John Fowles. And this one really took my imagination. It's a sailing ship called Mildred. And the poem is called Elegy for Mildred. Struck off Gurnard's Head, Cornwall, at midnight, April 6, 1912. Sometimes the wrecks are layered on top of older wrecks in this most deadly 10 square miles of sea. Mildred was Cornish built, 3-masted, hauling slag, her spars dark in the fog, her canvas slack. When the cry came, breakers ahead, the panicking crew ran through the night, trying to come about, while some climbed high in the rigging, assuming the ship was lost. The captain hollered up and promised safety, a boat they could all escape in, a sea calm in the fog. Indeed, they rowed along the cliffs and landed safe at St. Ives. On the hill, in dawn's clear light, the crowds gathered to watch as Mildred, upright still, settled into her bed. Local wreckers muttered, "Her cargo's useless, nothing to gain from the carcass, nor even her sails." But lovely they were, those sails, their rigging draped like skirts, and the topmost spars already forming a cross, as if her grave were waiting below, waiting for surf to break her back and part her seams and lick at the joints of the wheel and the gimbal ring of the compass, till dishes and socks and barrels of grog and charts that were useless to steer her home all would slowly let go and spiral down to settle in sand. Pieces of Mildred, barnacled Lagan, lie there still, the last of her elegance underneath mounds of silt, her shipwright's art forever lost to brine and time and waves that beckon and moan, beckon and grieve. So, here's another form. Where is it? This is a little villanelle, probably my favorite form. There's a little poem called Imaginary Islands. It also reflects my interest in old maps. I love to look at old maps, and you find on old maps these islands that appear for a year or two or a decade, and then later they disappear. And of course, somebody saw something through the fog and they marked an island there. Nobody knew what shape it was because they just got a glimpse of a cliff, or they thought they did. So they have these sort of symbolic or iconic shapes that they are marked with on the map, and sooner or later they're not there anymore. Imaginary islands. St. Brandon's, Atlantis, Macy's, and Swains are islands that never stayed still on the map. A shape in the mind is all that remains, though the sailor who saw one would rack his brains to remember the moment he threw up his cap and shouted, "Land ho!" at Macy's or Swain's. Cartographers drew them beside their new names as a circle or crescent, a leaf or a cup. But a shape in the mind is all that remains of that rock that loomed from torrential rains or parted the clouds, then slipped back through the gap. Was it Macy's, St. Brandon's, Atlantis, or Swain's, or some other echo a body retains from life in a warm sea, rocking asleep? A shape in the mind is all that remains as we boot our computers and run for our trains, or finger brochures for a long, slow sea trip to St. Brandon's, Atlantis, Macy's, or Swain's, in search of the shape, which is all that remains. Okay. This one takes an epigraph from the Bible. The book of Jonah, chapter 1, verse 11, which says, "For the sea wrought and was tempestuous." It's in two parts. One, and it's called Jonah Mid-Air. 1. His grubby tennis shoes fly up past his face as he somersaults backwards away from the Tarshish ferry. For a second, he looks straight down at the heaving waves and thinks that the whole damned ocean must be a creature whose swelling sighs, begun by some distant shore, were blown out here by the force of its beastly lungs, exhaling furious breath into flying foam and sucking in the night sky with its clouds, its moonbeams, and the nearest, most fragile stars that dare to wink through chinks in solid walls of rain, sucking so hard that everything, himself included, shortly will disappear in the beastly mouth. Fingers, feathers, shoes, and stardust falling into the bug and silt of the creature's belly. 2. It's at this moment that Jonah thinks about God. True, he lost his belief a long time ago, and it might be tempting to think of this storm as the Lord punishing him or calling him back to the fold. But Jonah knows better. Storms are not acts of God. He's studied the science. He's sure it's not his fault. So he yells, still flying, "Signor Magnifico, beast of the sea, not God, I salute your powers." Another massive wave rears up, rushes to meet his whirling body, slaps his soles, tosses him forward through the spray. He rises, gulping air. He spins. It doesn't matter what they will write. Jonah opens his eyes and knows the truth, plunging towards the deck. It's a rewriting of the story. I like to think he had landed up back on the deck of the boat where he started. So this last one I'm going to read from the water section of the reading. It's the last poem in the book. It's a palindrome poem. You probably know what a palindrome is. I'll just remind you, when it's a word, it's just a single word. It's a word like I, E-Y-E, or radar, R-A-D-A-R, or race car. It's a word that reads the same backwards as forwards. When a palindrome is a phrase, it's something more like, Satan sees Natasha, which also reads the same backwards, or straw warts, or a man of Panama. But when it's a poem, there's a number of different ways that people have done them. My method in this poem is based on the excellent palindrome poems of a poet named Peter Pereira, who's a Canadian guy. He's a doctor and a poet who lives in Vancouver, BC. Great guy, and he's written a lot of these palindromes. They're on his website. Mine is called The Surface, the Light. And I think you'll kind of get it. where the palindrome is, I mean. The surface, the light, green ceiling over my head. I was really close to drowning, bubbles from my nose rising toward the world I left behind. Was it true about seeing your life pass in front of your eyes? Whoever made up that story lied. I wasn't twirling gracefully in the current, with hair floating away from my staring face. It wasn't like a movie filmed in a pool, luminous weed lurking in innocent water. But something was dragging me down by the ankle. I opened my mouth and swallowed a piece of the ocean. I wanted to yell for help, but no one would hear, so I kicked off a shoe and grabbed the water by its neck, wondering if this salty world was a dream. Wondering if this salty world was a dream, I kicked off a shoe and grabbed the water by its neck. I wanted to yell for help, but no one would hear, so I opened my mouth and swallowed a piece of the ocean. Something was dragging me down by the ankle, luminous weed lurking in innocent water, but it wasn't like a movie filmed in a pool with hair floating away from my staring face. I wasn't twirling gracefully in the current. Whoever made up that story lied about seeing your life pass in front of your eyes, rising toward the world I left behind. Was it true I was really close to drowning? Bubbles from my nose, the surface, the light, green ceiling over my head. I wonder if I could get some water. I've got a cold. Oh, you have some here? Okay, I got water. Thank you. Sorry. I'm afraid my voice is going to get scratchy. If you can't hear me, please wave at me because I've got a cold right now. Thank you. So I think now I'm going to transition from the water element to the earth element and read a few also new poems before you all float away into the watery outdoors, which could happen. The poet Robert Haas is known for exploring loss with his elegies that he writes to fleeting moments and passing experiences. His probably most famous poem is Meditations at Lagunitas, and he starts that poem with the lines, "All the new thinking is about loss. In this it resembles all the old thinking." I think that a lot of poetry that's about landscape has to do with loss. And perhaps that's because we are losing our landscapes. Not only because we move around so much that a lot of us have lost the landscapes of our childhoods, but also because the landscapes themselves are being lost, are being clear-cut, are being built on and in one way or another exploited, so that there's a lot of sadness about landscape poetry, I think, because we have a nostalgia for the landscapes that are transitory. This is a poem called Lost Lands, and I take a few words from Robert Haas's poem at the beginning. A word is elegy to what it signifies. It's kind of a hard thought, I think. A word is elegy to what it signifies. Lost Lands. The thinking, old and new, is still about loss. So many pages filled with decaying Edens, places where poets, lovers, thoughtful people made the old mistake of going back. Tintern Abbey, blousy with candy wrappers. Fern Hill, faded from carefree green to mud. New Brunswick woods, crossed by nocturnal buses, but never bringing forth from scratchy shadows that perfect ambling moose, high as a church, bishop's sad-faced harbinger of joy. Yet, even knowing this, I enter the gash in the chalky hills, try to rekindle the past with steps that slide on trampled, grubby grass, and search again for my body's imprint, stretched deep in daisies, purple clover holding the shape of someone young, someone flat on her back, gazing past small brown bees, the sky smudged with wavering vapor trails of planes headed south where I always wanted to go. The word is honeysuckle. The life was sweet. So, it seems like there's been a lot of sad things. So I thought perhaps we could do with something a little lighter here. And one of the things that always cheers me up is breakfast. I love breakfast. It's my favorite meal. It's a good one, huh? Well, apparently Galway Kinnell likes his breakfast too, because he has a poem I love, which is about having breakfast with John Keats. Here's a line from that poem of Galway Kinnell's. It says, "That is why I often think up an imaginary companion to have breakfast with." And my poem is called Breakfast with Virginia. I don't know how many of you are really familiar with all the details of Virginia Woolf and the Bloomsburys, but there's a reference to Monk's House, which is where she and Leonard live, and there's a reference here to Leonard's elm. There were two elm trees which somehow got named Virginia and Leonard. And she also makes reference to the Bookers, which are the Booker Prizes in England, always a source of great controversy. Breakfast with Virginia. I made her my popular scrambled eggs. A little onion, some salsa stirred in, the mild kind, of course, since Mexican food can hardly have reached Monk's House back then. Good English toast, white bread, tasteless, cut into triangles, not a crust in sight. I even polished the silver rack, and the toast grew suitably cold and chewy like leather. But little by little, I started to feel that she secretly longed for kidneys, their fat congealing in the Victorian chafing dish, under a lid on a polished sideboard, or maybe a stinky yellow kipper. The marmalade, I'm sure, was perfectly fine. I opened the homemade jar my sister made when several oranges briefly appeared last year. Not that my guest remarked on the marmalade. By the time we reached the toast, she was in full flight, deploring the mediocrity of the Bookers and wondering what happened to Leonard's elm. I asked if she minded me having her over, at which she frowned and helped herself to butter. "I thought it might be interesting," she said, "to see how things have changed, how people think." I could tell as she paused that she didn't mean to be rude, which was odd, as it never used to bother her. "But what I've seen, alas," she said, "has made it clear that almost no one thinks. I can see it's not easy, given this world. The noise, the violence, the dreadful machines. But still, my dear," she meant me, I blushed, "it's been enlightening. But now I really must go." It's a great idea, imaginary breakfast companions. I thought I'd stay with another somewhat lighthearted poem, and this one actually also stays in the vicinity of Virginia Woolf by focusing in the first stanza on Vita Sackville West, who is, as you know, part of that whole story. This poem is an ode, which is a particular form. It's quite a demanding form, and I think I've never written any others like it. But I also think it's an ode which makes gentle fun of itself through the form here. It's got various rhymes and things like that. This is called Ode to Boots. She strides in jacket and breeches, brown boots knee-high, a ladder of small buttons clinging to each shapely calf. The grizzled wolfhound at her thigh stretches out mottled lips in a lupine laugh. I love this picture of Vita, her head thrown back, a gust of wind in her wake as she rushes along. But what I love best, of course, are her boots. Beautiful boots that stride and stamp and kick, shouting that, yes, such a female can really belong in this world. Oh, boots of delicious disrepute. Once I had a pair, but mine were black. I wore a pony club tie, my breeches were tan. At the junior show jumping down by Posingworth Lake, I swaggered all day and flourished my leather cane. Too big in dresses, too tall in heels. At 14, I heaved a sigh of relief and left behind my cloak of shame. The loudspeaker's muzzy blare, the pony's squeals, a slap on my back. I could almost believe I belonged here in the genderless boots of my mind. I crashed to hard-baked ground, crumpled in front of the painted poles, and the crowd let out a gasp. Pain shot up my leg. I uttered one grunt. A motherly woman ran from a tent. She clasped my hand. "Don't move," she whispered, drawing out a knife. I stared at the sky, breathed sweet smells of horse sweat, while she sliced my boot from knee to instep, peeling it back like the shell of a shrimp. I writhed on the Red Cross stretcher. I paid the price. Oh, single boot. Oh, dusty lone survivor. Perched on my bookcase, God of my teenage years. How can I go on being a true believer in you who've stamped out so many doubts and fears? You're collecting dust. Your shine is fading fast. You sulk and turn your perfect toe to the wall. But what really matters is that you remain up there. The echoes of your strides will last longer than the memory of the fall. Someday, surely, I'll find another pair. I've got two more poems. I'm going to get serious again for a moment here. Very serious, actually. I've lost my bit of paper. Where is it? I know I have it. There it is. My background to this poem. I flew in 2005. I can't get used to which century we're in here. 2005, in July 2005, I flew into London the morning after the bombs had gone off in the underground and the bus. They killed 56 people and injured more than 700 people. And it was an intense time to arrive in London and to be in London. I was there for a few weeks, and I wanted to write about it, but it was really hard to know how to do that. In the end, the thing that got me going, and this is something that I'm always interested in because I'm interested in forms of poems, and it's often the form that gets me somehow able to focus on something rather than thinking about the content or what it is that I want to say. I happened to go back and read W.H. Auden's famous poem, which is called September the 1st, 1939. So some of you know that poem. It's a poem which meditates upon the approach of World War II. And it's also got a very famous line, it is sometimes older than anyone remembers of it, which says, "We must love one another or die." Anyway, I noticed after I spent some time with that poem that it was written in what seemed to me kind of an unusual form for such a poem. First of all the lines were in trimeter, which means they were like a rhythm of three, like a waltz rhythm. And often, it's not very common in poetry, but often it's used in poems that are kind of light-hearted and also dancey. You know, they have a dancey rhythms. A famous Theodore Roethke poem called My Papa's Waltz, which is actually kind of a dark poem, but it's sort of on the surface, it's very light-hearted, and The little boy is waltzing with his father in the kitchen. Anyway, this poem of Auden's also had 11 lines in each stanza, which seemed like an odd number, and it had an unpredictable but definitely there rhyme pattern. So after I looked at it for a while and I thought, well, he wrote about something pretty heavy-duty in this form, I set myself the task of imitating that form, which is always a good thing to do. And this is the poem that I got out of that. And one more thing to tell you about it is that I don't know if it reached here, but you know, whenever there's a war or a disaster, it seems that in the media there's like one iconic image which gets to stand for that event. It's a little child running from a bomb or whatever the image is. And in England, over the weeks following that event, the image that was everywhere was an image of an elderly woman being led out of the underground station with her head completely bandaged in white bandage with just one eye hole. And it was on the front page of the papers and on the news, and it was very well recognized. So my poem is called The London Bombs, and I have a couple of lines from Auden's poem at the beginning. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. This time, it's early July, and more than 6 decades have loosed a spate of speech where once grave tongues were tied. Death's on the lips of each smooth-talking TV head, projecting sincerest concern at the camera's red-hot eye. A rotten smell pervades the air. Only the dead can catch the spinning lie. Survivors, poxy with soot, stumble into the light. Photographers flash at the mask of a swaddled face, white like the bandaged invisible man, except that the left eye's covered, the right a mystery. One foot in front of the other, huddled into a stranger, she asks, "What happened?" "Don't worry, love," he says. "Hop into the van." Deep in the earth, dig and sift and chase off rats in 110-degree heat. Up top, flowers, photos of lovers who will never be found, handbags, odd shoes, a wig, sunglasses, half-burned hats. Rumors swirl around as dust wafts from the feet of doctors, policemen, cats from the tunnel, triumphant crows. No good asking, why do we never learn, or what makes the young men suicidal? No good bemoaning the hate afflicting not just the idle, the disenfranchised, the poor. Before each and every war, some poet has seen the signs and sat at a table, his cry crafted too soon or too late into useless, shapely lines. I watch a small brown dog trot past the yellow tape of the crime scene, cordoned off in front of the station. The shape of attention, the hopeful wag, the whiskery head cocked to one side, all tell a story of daily meeting and greeting. But now, with his front door locked, it's buzz-off dog, and sorry, he's joined the ranks of the waiting. The dense commuters come into some new kind of life, strap hangers said to be stoic, or is it brave or merely numb? Which wrist veined like a leaf? Which muscled calf? Which ear will rip or burn in the thick of the next explosion? Fear is quiet. The human race hurtles through tunnels, its gaze averted in its bandaged face. So I'm going to end by reading just one poem from my last full-length collection, which is Horses and the Human Soul. I'm going to read the last poem. Actually, I'm going to dedicate this to Paul Ann, because Paul Ann knows this poem. I also want to read it because, in an odd kind of way, in my mind, it kind of brings together the water and the earth elements. It's a poem called Fibonacci, and it's about that Fibonacci sequence of numbers that translates into the golden proportion which we find everywhere in nature, in most famously in the nautilus shell or the sunflower, but equally in the human body, the proportions of the parts of the human body. And it seems to me that it encompasses all of the earth and the water where we've been tonight. Fibonacci, his numbers 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, each the sum of the two before, appear like a rabbit from a hat in the spiral of nautilus, the head of each bowed sunflower. Even the two that sway in my front yard, their papery stalks beginning to bend from the work of holding up crestfallen heads. And speaking of rabbits, which I was, Fibonacci has a hand in the way they breed, generations hopping to his golden rule, the rule whose shadow lingers, a palimpsest in the horn of mountain goat, parrot's beak, the inevitable and precise curl of an elephant's trunk. What symmetry! 13, 21, 34. We could feel it in our bones if we tried. Human head to navel, navel to toes, or traveling upward, belly button to the kissable hollow of the throat, and from there straight to the highest point, where, as children, we balanced the ruler and made our mark, 3'6", 1951, never noticing how our limbs reflect his math, never knowing ourselves related by proportion to the shell we would one day scoop up at the tide line, smiling at its oddly familiar grace. Thank you very much. So I'm told that you like to have either a question discussion time, either formally while you're sitting here or informally. I mean, I will be here for a little while, and I don't really know what you prefer to do, but I'm happy to be part of any kind of discussion. If anybody has a question that occurs to them now, so that everyone could hear it, that would be fine. But if not, then we'll just sort of do it in smaller moments.
Oh, I have one.
Yeah,
I
okay.
always have one.
Okay.
But where are the musicians' seamounts and so forth?
Oh dear.
Oh, okay.
They are well. They're part of something called the fracture zone. Is anybody here a good? I almost had a friend who came with a marine biologist, and we would have had a perfect answer to that. The fracture zone runs north to south in the Pacific, but I can't tell you exactly where in the Pacific. Somewhere out there where it's very deep. That's all I can tell you. I should find out though, because somebody else will ask me.
I was just curious.
I know it's a Pacific feature anyway.
Have you written poetry most of your life, or did you start after you wrote your memoir?
Oh no, I wrote poetry most of my life. I was fortunate to go to a school in England where we did quite a lot of poetry, and although I never showed it to anybody, I did write, as a teenager, and hid it in the drawer like so many. I wrote prose only as far as I was required to write essays as a young person. And then, but my first poetry book, I wrote a very short piece of memoir, and I didn't really know that was what it was when I was doing it. It was sort of before the big explosion of memoirs, but I got very interested in that genre, and then worked for a number of years on the memoir, and I'm working on another one now. Yes. Yeah.
When was that first memoir?
When was it published? 2000. It's a while back now. It's called Life Saving, a memoir. We actually have copies here. Yeah.
Have you yourself very nearly drowned, or did you just talk to someone to that?
No, I took life-saving classes, and so we had to do a lot of diving for things deep down, and sometimes I would get panicky, I would think I'd stayed too long and I wasn't going to get back up. but I don't think I really did nearly drown. But I kind of had a sense of that feeling of what it's like when you something, oh, maybe I went too far or stayed too long. Probably that's the closest I've come to that experience. And it never really made me afraid to do it. I kept doing it. It was one of those things that I just kind of liked to scare myself a little bit. Some things I hate to be scared at, but that wasn't one that stopped me. Yeah.
How long have you been in the United States, and without putting you on the spot too much, do you prefer England or?
Well, this is definitely my home. I've been here since 1976. Well, I came in 75 for the first time, so it's a long time. I made a home here, have family here now. I would not want to live in England anymore, but I love to go and visit. There are a few things that I miss still, and a lot of them are landscapes. And used to be certain foods, but I think I've grown out of that. And I have just a couple. I have a handful of friends left. I mean, it's been a long time. I go there quite regularly. I have a sister there and some other nieces and nephews, but I actually kind of have a writing life there. I teach for the poetry school, the UK Poetry School, which is a wonderful outfit. So I go every year and do something like that, either in England or in Spain, which they have an outpost in Spain. And I like to give readings in England. It's a sort of a whole different experience to drop into that whole literary community, which is pretty different than the one here. So I wouldn't want to, I don't like it better in that I'd want to go live there, but I do like to visit. Anything else?
Thank you very much.
You're very
Judith,
welcome. I'll
for
hang
being
around
here.
and I'd be happy to chat with people.
Yeah, please
Sign
enjoy,
books.
enjoy the refreshments.
Thanks.
There are books here.